Boardroom Bound, Episode 54, How to Navigate the Ever-Changing Board Space with Amy Rojik.
I see the future of financial reporting changing, and I see that requests for transparency that are being driven in the marketplace. It's really, I think it's something that's been, for a long time coming from more of the institutional investors. I see that shifting significantly to retail investors.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's show, we're speaking with Amy Rojik. She is a partner for national assurance at BDO. She leads the firm's external center for corporate governance. She's been involved for about a decade with her annual board survey. And in today, she's going to break down those results for us. She's going to show us some really interesting trends. There's a lot of implications for us in terms of how we should be focusing our time. We're also going to see there might be some leading indicators based on what the board members that they interviewed are telling us. Really cool stuff for today. Let's jump into the show. Amy Rojik, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to speak to you today.
Well, I'm excited because BDO has been doing this survey for, 8 or 9 years. So you've got lots of data, lots of history and information. And it's a survey that, as we discussed before, covers quite a range of organizations. We always tend to think about the biggest, the largest companies, medium size, small size, the startups. You guys are giving best practice and insights that a lot of people can use. And for our audience, that's highly appropriate because even if many of us aspire to be on what I would call the equivalent of center field for the Yankees, the biggest boards, you got to start at the minor leagues, AAA, AA, single A, and work your way up. So you guys are doing a lot of work, not only for the big ones, but working especially with some of the smaller ones, some of those startups that are growing and developing as well. So I know that we will touch on all of that. So that will be helpful for all of our audience today. And before we get into a lot of these exciting information pieces of data that you got out of the survey, maybe we can set the scene for our audience and help us understand what does it look like for you today? You're a national assurance partner. You lead the BDO Center for Corporate Governance. Probably just didn't get there overnight. How did that grow and develop for you in your career?
Yeah, of course. Well, first I should set the stage, and maybe you made a reference to the Yankees, but I might have to bring it back to New England, Patriots, and Red Sox fans. So might have to just hold you to that one. But well, I started out as a public accountant, and I worked on a lot of larger Fortune 500 companies earlier in my career. Also worked on smaller companies as well, really designed around financial reporting and accounting. And I started to morph into more of the education for both our professionals in our firms and then for our clients. And kind of taking that step forward in kind of producing that content, really saw a need at the board level, particularly with audit committees, in terms of really keeping them honed in on what was most important to them at a level that they needed to understand better in their oversight roles. So while it kind of was a higher level introduction to the board, it really focused on emerging issues. And that just kind of generally and organically morphed into really looking at the board more broadly and the various committees and pulling in resources across our firm and our practices that really jive with, all of the committees of the board. So that's something that I'm really proud of that our firm was able to do. And it started out, as I said, organically, and now it's grown where we're doing a lot of external involvement with other organizations like the National Association of Corporate Directors, the Association of Audit Committee Members, Inc., and a host of others. And it's just really taken off because there is such a need, I believe, in the boardroom for continuing education. And that's something that, when I travel around the country and participate, whether it's events sponsored by our own firm or whether we're involved with other organizations, it's something that there's such a need for, and the directors that participate in them are so engaged and so ready and willing to be learning more because I think they're under a tremendous amount of pressure in today's society, particularly public companies. And I should indicate that the primary focus of my work is with public company boards, although a lot of the thought leadership and the discussion points that we produce are equally important to nonprofit and private company boards as well. So I'm really pleased that our firm has embraced this and really allowed me to kind of take and expand upon this, and in the process involve a lot of other people. I'm certainly don't take any or all credit at all. We have a lot of folks that pitch in and produce a lot of our content, and it really stems from conversations with directors themselves. So I don't take that lightly, and very fortunate to get to interact with the people I get to interact with on a daily basis. So.
Well, just picking up on something you mentioned there, continuing education is the way I will describe it. And for our audience, some of whom are aspiring directors, thinking about it, planning about it, and it's something you are constantly trying to evolve. You're trying to become the best person you can bring in the boardroom. It might be a certain topic that the company is facing. You're constantly learning and growing. I had the pleasure of being at the last NACD annual summit and doing a live version of this podcast. And it was so much fun to be in a room with 1,000+ board members who are all eager to learn and grow and develop. And I think that's one of the fun parts about being in our space is it's constantly changing. There's new topics coming up to focus on. And we'll talk about that in some of your survey. It's probably part of the fun for you. There's always new things to be preparing for. What's coming down the line? How do we bring our best selves to solve this? And when you think about that today, I don't know if any of the survey results surprised you, but what did you expect before the survey came out that people were going to be saying they needed to be focusing on, and in versus what did you actually start to find as the information came in?
It's funny. I think of all the topics in the survey that were probably most surprising for me was really the thought around the evolution of non-financial reporting that's taking place globally. And when I say non-financial, I'm really talking about ESG and sustainability reporting. So it's all that extra information that really is being designed to tell a story about a company and the long-term sustainability that they're trying to build for not only shareholders, but for all stakeholders that they're engaged with. And I think that was an important part of the survey because it really felt like there was a low finding rate when we asked directors, and when our interview was focused on about 180 public company directors of all sizes, small and mid-cap companies and large companies as well, and it was a good distribution across those three types or size companies. But they all kind of indicated kind of a lukewarm approach to whether or not sustainability was really something they should be focused on. But all of the anecdotal information that I've received subsequently, and I had the pleasure of attending two conferences in early December of 2019. One was the SASB Sustainability Conference, and the second was the AICPA's Conference on Current Developments at the PCAOB and SEC. And that was a topic that was really important and really had a lot of energy in the room. And it was something that I just see the future of financial reporting evolving to. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the frameworks internationally, but there's a multitude of frameworks, which makes this more of a complexity than probably needs to be. But there is a very significant drive from stakeholders in this, and I think that ties into some of the recent thoughts around the Business Roundtable and the over 180 prominent CEOs that have really kind of started to change the definition of corporate governance here in the United States, and not looking not only at shareholder, but at all stakeholders and what the board has to bring to bear for that. And I think that's an important conversation that more and more people are having. I don't think it's a new concept. I think it's just something that's kind of been thrust into the limelight, if you will. So I see the future of financial reporting changing, and I see that the requests for transparency that are being driven in the marketplace, and it's really, I think it's something that's been, I guess, for a long time coming from more of the institutional investors. I see that shifting significantly to retail investors and to the next kind of generation of investors that are starting to amass significant amounts of capital and really want their desires known, and they're holding corporate companies accountable for their actions and steps they're taking to preserve value for the long run.
It's interesting you talk about the Business Roundtable. My prior roles at JP Morgan, Jamie Dimon was leading that organization. And at JP Morgan, he was a huge proponent of ESG and sustainability. My final role was in the corporate sustainability group, and we were actually working on a lot of this information. And I always thought that was totally sensible for a large company with big resources impacting the entire world to be reporting on. But I imagine for smaller organizations that feel like they have a very different footprint, different amount of resources, they might feel very differently. What did the survey tell us about that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's that's a clear distinction in the survey. I think if you look at kind of the results, and our report is available within our Center for Corporate Governance, it really tipped the scales. I mean, I think by and large, I think it was about 47%, and I can go back and get the exact numbers, but I think the larger companies were really actively or starting to be more actively engaged in producing this type of information within, a structured report, whereas the smaller and mid-cap companies, particularly the smallest of the small, so the nano caps, are probably not quite there yet. And I think it's all for the reasons you just cited, the resource constraints in a company like that. I think when you start thinking about the, susceptibility or the interest of the institutional investors, they're not paying a whole lot of attention necessarily to that group of folks. They may not necessarily feel that pressure. Although on the flip side of that coin, everyone wants their stock to be trading on a regular basis. So they're trying to capture attention. They need those analysts to follow them. So they want to be doing things different, and they want to be telling the story if they have a good story to tell in the market before somebody else tells it for them. I think that's one of the biggest takeaways that I've gotten out of my research into sustainability and ESG reporting and the value that I keep providing. So I view my role in terms of helping our own clients really understand, because this is evolving at a significant pace. You have the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, which is a non-authoritative body, but highly respected group of individuals that have come up with 77 industry-specific standards that are being now utilized in practice to help companies formulate their approach to reporting on ESG and giving a structure so that there can be some sort of, integrity to the information that's coming out of this. Because if you think about it, this information that's being reported, it could have a very material impact on financial statements, right? But it doesn't necessarily derive from financial information in the sense of it's controlled by generally accepted accounting principles. So I think there's a definite need for some value add and integrity around that information to get people comfortable with it. And it's also in a situation where it's not quite comparable among companies, among industries, because everyone has a different means of reporting. So organizations like the SASB are really trying to put some guidelines around how to report information to allow investors to be able to see what's really happening with companies and be able to make informed decisions when they're making investments.
I actually thought your report covered so much information across such a wide swath of different topic areas that I imagine someone picking up for the first time who's perhaps an aspiring board member, it might blow their brain thinking like, I have to think through all of this stuff. I have to become knowledgeable at all this. I have to be able to add value across all of this, which I partly find exciting and partly find daunting. And, my personal view of a board role is it should be a 50-50. There's a place that you bring value in a lot of the topics, but you're also going to learn and grow in a lot because that's really interesting. If you are that sort of person who's going, maybe I'm on a nonprofit now, I want to be on a public company board someday, or I'm just below the C-suite, I plan to be in a board someday, someone could look at this and go, wow, how could I possibly know all of this and become an expert on it? How do you advise people in that sort of situation?
Well, I think that's right. I think that's first the largest expectation that a board of directors needs to understand walking into the door, especially an aspiring board member. There's no shortage of information that you have that you're responsible for. And it doesn't matter what type of company you're serving, because I think as we all kind of can appreciate, especially in a world that's digitally transforming, that, shrinking in terms of globalization and in terms of the speed of information that's available, how interconnected companies are becoming, and the reliance upon supply chains and other sourcing of information. I think it is a daunting task, to use your words. And I think for a director or aspiring director, one of the things I think they really need to understand at the gate is how am I going to prioritize? I think that's probably the most fundamental piece of information or area of focus that a board member is responsible for. How do I prioritize the risks and opportunities facing the company? When I look at the strategy that management has laid out, how do I assess that? How do I advise management on that? And how do I stay above the fray of that information, right? So you're trying to digest what's coming at a company, what's coming at it currently, because for small companies, some of them are just trying to keep their head afloat, right? So they're probably single most focused maybe on, how do I remain liquid in a very turbulent environment? Or if you're a more established company and you have the resources, how do you channel those resources? How are you building out for the future? How are you identifying the risks that you haven't even thought about that are coming up to, nip at your ankles and overtake you if you're not being forward thinking enough? So I think there's a lot that gets placed upon the board, and I really think having a very well-defined set of responsibilities and guidelines that allow the board to divvy up those responsibilities among the directors is really helpful. So things like committee charters, having the right mix of committees, having, of course, the right composition of board and experience on that board, but even as importantly as the experience of the board members themselves, I think really having the resources at your disposal, whether it's the strength, the bench strength of your management team at the C-suite and several levels below, and then having the bench strength of advisors, whether it's your auditors, whether it's your legal counsel, whether it's external advisory professionals, whoever it is, it's having that composite of expertise around you that you can draw from. So I often get questions from directors, do I need a cyber expert on my board? Well, that's really your call. It really varies. Is cybersecurity one of the premier risks of your organization? And that's something where, maybe if you don't have a chief information security officer or a structure that can support that, maybe you do need a cyber expert on your board. Or if you have folks knowledgeable in cyber and you have resourcing at your fingertips, maybe that's not, where you need to go. So I think it's really facts and circumstances based, and probably dumping a lot of information at you right now, but I think it's really critical for a board to be able to kind of dig through and sift through the information that's coming at them, recognize their strengths, what they're really knowledgeable in, and what they need to get knowledgeable in. And I've had a recent example where, you mentioned the NACD Global Board Leaders Summit. BDO has championed the small cap forum in that particular conference for the last 4 years. That was an area, as I mentioned earlier to you in our conversation, that I just felt like there was a real need for small companies that are resource constrained, and the focus for too long, I believe, has really been on the largest of the large companies in terms of governance. So we've been helping the NACD both pull together the content and identify really informed directors that have sat on our panels and have really given great guidance and thoughts, and it's to a very engaged audience. And we've watched that particular symposium build over the last 4 years, and it's really something. And I sat on a panel earlier in December with a director who sits on a very large financial institution, and she indicated, and I wear several board hats, and I really was interested to learn more about, what's going on with my smaller board. And I was so glad to attend, and there was so much information there that, I just hadn't thought of in specific angles. So it was really good to hear that, because I think you have those directors, and I think they're more often than not those individuals that have a really strong sense of what they need to do as, overseers of companies.
So, Amy, you touched on a lot there, and I think that something that stood out to me as I reflect back on the survey that you found today and the interesting nuggets that we need to sift through versus, say, let's pretend about a decade ago when the first survey came out. I think the world's a bit of a different place today. When I think of, say, the pace of change and a broad variety of pressures from a broadening stakeholder base, it's really forcing directors to, I would say, truly consider their roles and remaining focused on the more critical aspects of a business's survival. So it feels like maybe you got to run a bit faster around that wheel today. Does that seem right to you?
Yeah, it really does. I think we had a particular finding with respect to questions that we were asked at boards around digital transformation. I think we're really kind of, pivotal to what you were just saying, because I think one of the things that with technology coming fast and furious at companies from all angles of their business that impact all aspects of their operations, including their disclosures around financial reporting and other things, I think one of the things that we're really looking to boards to understand is what steps are they taking to address these things. And it was interesting to kind of break down by size of company and kind of see where folks were at. And I think increasing capital allocation towards digital initiatives is obviously something that's of interest to a lot of companies, particularly the larger companies, where obviously they're investing a lot, and it goes down significantly from there. So as you can imagine, the largest of the large companies are being the leaders in this space. And I think that's something that's going to be very, very interesting to watch as smaller and mid-sized companies need to really step up their investments and understanding in this area, because they run the risk of being left behind if they don't have significant strategies in place to address this in all aspects of their business.
I think that's fair. And something else that really struck out to me from your survey results, when I put my director hat on and I imagine, the kind of things that keep me at night for the boards, keep me up for the boards that I am on, sometimes they're company specific, sometimes they're more macro. And I feel like you guys got a bit of a nugget there. And I've never really thought about the board surveys as a leading indicator, right? So you talk about how the boards are actively preparing for an economic downturn, and there's a large percentage doing that there. So we know that the ride cannot continue upwards. At some point, it's got to go back to normalcy. Do you feel like we've got some predictions in here?
I think that's what they would be. They would be kind of crystal ball predictions. But I think if companies are smart, they're looking toward strategies that are taking advantage of some of the, some of the very technical aspects of, say, tax reform, for example. They're looking at strategies that are going to impact whether they have domestic operations or global operations. They're looking to insulate themselves with respect to trade policies that, impact global supply chains and other things. They're really taking steps to assess worst case scenarios. Like, what happens if we're not able to, get some suitable answers with China and others, right? So I think that's going to be a very telling situation for a lot of companies. So you have to hedge your bets a little bit on where the market's going to go. And then from an economic standpoint, I think for a long time, for several years now, we've been enjoying a really significant rise, and companies have a lot of cash on their balance sheets. And what is that going to be used for? I think some people may be, holding on to that cash with an expectation that things are going to go sour, but have they been investing in the infrastructure? Have they been investing in talent? I think talent is a significant risk that companies need to be looking at, regardless of whether the economy goes up or down. I think things are going to continue to move forward from a digital perspective, and from the rapid pace of, AI and other things taking over. I think companies that are not thinking about, the changing workforce population and needs of their employees are going to be left behind. So I think the good news is that it seems to me like a lot of our folks in our survey are taking those to task and to be investing, or at least considering these things. And that's something that we're promoting, again, from an educational standpoint, to really make sure people understand where things are headed and what it means to have a digital transformation strategy and how you should be looking at that. Similarly, on the data side of things, I think we're going to see a huge, getting beyond some of the economic and geopolitical concerns. I think looking at the sheer volume of data and keeping that data safe and protected and private. There's an influx of data privacy rules that companies need to be adhering to, and boards need to understand that. They need to understand the policies and the safeguards that their management teams are putting around that data, because with an interconnected world that we have, data's flying all over the place, and without the proper safeguards, I think companies can be really putting themselves at risk, and the board is at the head of that table. So I think there's no shortage of topics to cover here, and each year when we do select topics for the survey to kind of pick people's brains on, we're really trying to needle down into those things that we really think are going to have the most impact on companies, and they may not be thinking of that in those terms.
Well, one other one I would just love to touch upon quickly is, you were just talking about talent, and the word that a lot of people throw out there is generally diversity. And I was really surprised by the results that came out. The majority of boards do not report on diversity. And we were just talking about sort of leading indicators, people looking ahead, what's coming down the line, do we need to be on top of? And it seems to me the topic du jour, where everywhere I go for any board event, any discussion, is always about diversity. And often it's gender, which is very easy to see. It could also be represented by skin color, but I think there's all sorts of things. Where did you come from in the world? Your socioeconomic background, age is a big one in terms of your customers. So I think you need all sorts of diversity to get diversity thought to be successful as a board. I was really intrigued to see, given that is such a hot trend from great groups like 2020 Women on Board, 30% Club, all these organizations really pushing that discussion out there, and it seems to be more and more recognition around it. But the survey results contrasted with this. I'd love your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's funny. I think when you think about diversity, like you just said, I think there's a lot of focus, particularly with all of the things that are happening right now, with the big push for, the S&P 500 finally having, a full population of companies in that index, at least for the time being, that have at least one female director on their board for the first time. I think that's a huge step for corporate America. But again, it doesn't end there, right? Because I think if you look at the smaller companies, there's not that same mix. And when you think about how the exchanges are compiled, smaller companies are by and large far outnumber the largest of the large companies. So I think we have a long way to go in terms of gender parity. I don't think we're nearly there yet. And I think, like yourself, I'm involved in several things. In fact, I was fortunate enough to attend my first 30% Club meeting earlier this fall in 2019, where the topic was really focused on the director pipeline and opportunities for succession. And how do we build that pipeline of individuals from a broad sense? Whether it's women, whether it's ethnicity, whether it's age, but considering those opportunities and creating those pipelines for people. And I think really proactive companies are really taking a look at that. And I think when you start to think about the demand for talent, I mean, too often, you hear about, well, I need somebody from the C-suite. I need a CEO, or I need a former CFO to head up my audit committee. It's really taking a step beyond that and looking at where is my company going? What are the types of products we're producing? Who's our consumer? Who are our supply chain? Who are our employees, right? So it's more, you want the board to be reflective of the company that they're serving. So if you have a board that's full of one very, very industry-based, very C-suite driven board, that may be great from an operational perspective, but if you start thinking strategically, is that really the direction that your company needs to go? And I've had a lot of good experience with companies that we work with when they approach us and say, look, we're really looking to truly diversify our board, not just hitting a quota, but really trying to get some new information, new ideas at the board level. We have a nicely functioning board. How do we do that? So one of the things that we ask, companies in their consideration is like, well, there's opportunities for that. First, doing a formal skill set review. And our survey really picked up on that, and people are doing those things and taking them very seriously and doing a deep dive evaluation into determining what skills do we have, what skills do we need, and using that as a foundation for the future. So how are we going to select a good slate of candidates to balance out our board when we need to? How do we get that expertise onto the board? And then how else can we do that? How else are we going to position ourselves? Do we expand our board potentially? If we have a very well-functioning board, do we expand that and bring on some other directors? Do we let them shadow and then bring them on when it's appropriate, or just expand our board and have that additional group of thought? I think that comes down to kind of the cultural aspects of a fully functioning board. So again, there's a lot of factors that I think go into this, and there's not a one-size-fits-all approach. But I think from, getting back to your original question on diversity, I think there is a recognition in there, and it's not just being driven by, organizations out there that are really keen on this. I think the conversation that's happening at all levels. I know that, the regulators are looking at this, for example. This is not something that's really taken lightly, and I think a lot of, obviously, pressure from investors, from proxy advisors, in terms of voting no if your board doesn't reflect a good, sense of diversity to them. They will vote no against against board chairs or others, nomination committee chairs. So I think it's something that people really need to start thinking about more from a an operational perspective than anything. Because again, I think what you're trying to get to at the end of the day is a group of leaders on the board that bring to bear a large amount of experience and a good diversity and perspective, I think is the best way to probably think about that. Something that can lead you forward and ask, the questions about where's our company now, where do we need to be, where are we headed?
And clearly you talk on this stuff a lot. I can see that you share this information, this knowledge, whether you're talking to individual boards or at events and whatnot. And I believe you have more of those sorts of opportunities coming up that maybe our audience should know about. They might like to see you in person to hear some of these. And you probably have some more publications coming out soon too, right?
We do. There's no shortage of things we're coming out with. One thing in particular that should be being released in early January of 2020 is our annual audit committee agenda. And that kind of tees up a lot of topics that audit committees should be seeking out when they're considering their year-end financial reporting. We also are sponsoring an event with the NACD New England, and I will be moderating a panel on the proxy advisory season. I'm really excited about that. We're going to have a lot of really great panelists that are going to give broad perspectives on proxy season and what boards should be anticipating from shareholders. So looking forward to that on January 14th of 2020 in Boston.
Well, Amy, we were delighted to have you on this show today. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Well, I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for the opportunity.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Amy Rojik. I appreciate her breaking down their annual survey of data from the boardroom. We got some fantastic insights about what matters, what doesn't matter, how to manage it all in this crazy fast-paced boardroom world that we're in. And we also got a sneak peek of some leading indicators that the boardroom directors are telling us about. Now, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you can get links to all of today's resources. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.